What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WAEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
Yes, it's a great question, and certainly one that I spent quite a bit of time thinking about since I've spent a number of years in the private sector. And I would say at the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. Whether it's talking about improving infrastructure, we're providing services to our citizens, accelerating clean energy, providing help for grandma, grandpa on Medicare, Medicaid. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility. I worked in the White House, and my office has been occupied by a number of other administrators of federal procurement policy, just down the hallway from the Secretary of State suite. And so I definitely felt a sense of history, and where a lot of the major national policies were determined and debated and executed on. And so that perspective certainly fosters a really deep sense of humility. The private sector, on the other hand, operates under a very different set of pressures, certainly pressures nonetheless, though. That leads to a lot more agility and autonomy, which in turn, I think, yield a lot more innovation and risk-taking, because they have to meet those goals within these really much shorter and much more controllable parameters, in my personal opinion. I think, being able to balance those short-term returns with long-term strategy is a real challenge in the private sector.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WAEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. It's not that profit-driven is bad, but it's a different view, it's a different lens on revenue. Mm-hmm. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
So I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites in airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women. And I was the only woman of color. Furthermore, because I joined the aerospace industry, a couple of years after the defense drawdown, post-Cold War end, the company hadn't hired new people in about 7 years. So not only was I the only woman of color, I was also the youngest person, reasonably by far, throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, no, this actually impacts the design of the bird, and these are the things that we really want to take care of, et cetera. And I guess in hindsight, perhaps I was politely dismissed, if you will. What does the new kid know, et cetera, type of thing. But, in my heart, I knew that the issue was real, and stayed with it, and sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down and work hard, et cetera. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, et cetera, even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief, I have these strong held beliefs around diversity. And I recognize that DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics. All organizations are mosaics. All technical designs are also mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And being able to think through what lens are they looking at the problem with, and therefore how might I think about solving and addressing the design or the program or whatever the case might be. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one coming from the insurance industry. That's an industry which is working on that to get better at it, but it's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. I'm right with you on that. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
Certainly working at the White House, there's a number of challenges that we face every day. But one moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. And we had some very bold targets around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing renewable energy use, improving efficiency, energy efficiency, water efficiency, electrifying our federal fleets, et cetera. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. How do we get the appropriations? How do we ensure that we're able to allocate the resources appropriately in order to be able to achieve these goals? One of my greatest partners actually was the Department of Defense in thinking creatively about how do we leverage more creative financing models like energy savings performance contracts or public-private partnerships in order to be able to accomplish the goals. And that was particularly important at the time, since we had troops deployed overseas still in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's only so much funding that I can ask for to support, that I felt right asking for to be able to support the sustainability mission. And so, we overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this, et cetera. But first and foremost, I really focused on building strong relationships across the entirety of the federal government, listening to them. What are the realities on the ground that you're trying to address? Veterans Administration at the time was addressing the appointments issue where veterans were not able to secure appointments, within 3 months to be able to go see their doctors. And so how do we think about, in the midst of that type of environment, how can I help be able to work with these agencies to meet the goals that were set out for us? And thinking through, again, creatively around how do we make these upgrades without needing to provide that kind of upfront capital? How do we work through some of the very complicated rules that OMB and Treasury would, instill upon agencies? And I think that experience really reinforced for me a big learning in that in government, I think in general, and certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority. And that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth. It takes a lot of shoe leather, it takes a lot of engagement, a lot of energy, but in the end, that's how you end up developing really good solutions that stick.
Excellent. As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, where the government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, that is often the long-term policy direction for many of, the industries that we end up working that are here in our nation. But of course, it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute at scale. And then, partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. So whether it be workforce development issues or addressing housing issues to support the growth, the economic growth of various societies or various communities within our nation. One of those things that I learned in my experience, both at OMB and federal government, as well as when I was in impact investing, is that public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. How can you align incentives and ensure that there's a way for private sector has a viable business case that they can actually make a profit, that we have some stable policy signals. And I think that's when real transformation can and does actually happen. That said, the relationship isn't always easy. As I mentioned before, the symbol of thunder is a swirl, and there are times when there's friction at each of those interfaces. But and the 3 sectors, of course, speak different languages. Just because we speak English doesn't mean it's all the same language. And so thinking through how we can all collectively work together in that kind of systemic thinking sort of way is incredibly vital to ensure that we're collectively moving the nation towards a better future.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium that's paid over the first really 5-6 years. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. After 5 years, then that's when all the net income comes. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. They, like you had said earlier, it's next quarter's earnings reports. So that's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
So for those folks who are interested in government, if you're not in government already, please consider public service. It is a wonderful, wonderful mission, and I think that you will enjoy your experiences. But I also think that there are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Leadership in government isn't about titles or hierarchy. Again, it's about service. And so since you're working on behalf of the American people, often on issues that are tremendously complex, government is there for a reason. We address the market failures. We are helping society. That can be incredibly rewarding, but also very frustrating at times. And so it's really important to stay connected to your why. What's your purpose? Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector, where you are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. We deal with some of the largest disasters, the fires in Los Angeles, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and when stuff like that happens, like, you need to ensure that there's that trust either there already and or very quickly be able to build that trust with the folks, the local communities and other entities in order to be able to help address the challenges. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. My own path certainly wasn't linear at all. And I started out as an engineer, went into business and spent a lot of time in the private sector and, took what I thought would be a short detour into government, loved it, ended up staying, a lot longer than I thought because I certainly found a lot of meaning in that work. And so, absolutely stay open to the unexpected, say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy, it's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. This is always a fun question to round out our time together. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
So that's a tough question. It's not just one person for me. I'm a mosaic person, as I mentioned before. The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has pearls of wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. How do you, on a very tactical level, think about that for your career? And building out those types of relationships so that you can also, have influence around your colleagues. And certainly, last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.